I remember as a young child, there'd be a knock at my door, and my father would come in and he'd say, "It's time to go to school." And I would get up and I would brush my teeth and eat breakfast and get ready for the day. I grew up in Lansing, Michigan, on the south side of Lansing, Michigan, off what is now called Martin Luther King Boulevard. And we would get into the car. Of course, because I grew up in Michigan, most days that meant that there was snow on the car in the morning, there was ice on the car, and so we would scrape the car off. And growing up, we often had a car that the heater would not work, so sometimes we would freeze to death on the way to school. But the one constant on the way to school was my father would listen to NPR. And so from a very early age to a much older age, I would learn about the events in the world. I'd learn about the events in the United States. And my father would have conversations with me about those events. And that was a constant throughout my childhood. So I was always very, very interested in public policy. I was very interested in politicians. I was very interested in the happenings in the United States and across the world, maybe unusually so for someone so young, inspired by those conversations that I heard on the radio and those conversations that my father would have with me about different political events. In the summers, I would spend time with my grandmother. She was a librarian in an urban middle school in Saginaw, Michigan. And she would take me to school with her as school was wrapping up each year. And I would spend time in her library. I'd spend time pulling books off the shelves. I would spend time at recess with the kids in that school. And I would spend time with my aunt, who was a principal and a superintendent of urban schools in Michigan. And I just developed a love for the school environment, for educating. And so as I went on to the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, I was a major in history and psychology, which is very different than the kind of work that I do now, but in education policy. But it really laid an important foundation for me in the humanities and the social sciences. And so when it came time, as graduation approached, I thought very carefully about, did I want to go to law school? Did I want to get an MBA? What did I want to do with my life? Did I just want to start working? And I thought to myself that I thought about the lineage of educators in my family. I thought about how much, how interested I was in public policy. And I thought to myself, I would really like to study education policy. So in the mid-1990s, I started my first year at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. My second year was in the higher education program, master's program. And so that launched me to my first position in the Houston Independent School District. At the time, Rod Page, or as we called him in the district, Coach Page, was the superintendent of the district. And the conversation at that time was that Texas was having an education miracle. And when I went for my interview in Texas, I was told that there were urban high schools in the city of Houston that had dropout rates of 0%. And I thought to myself, this is too good to be true. And they told me that Houston had essentially closed the achievement gap on the Texas TOS test. And I thought to myself, after finishing my master's, Houston's where I need to be. Accountability and high stakes testing was showing a lot of promise. But when I arrived in Houston, I realized that it was a facade. And so I would, as a part of my responsibilities, I had access to a lot of the data in the district. I was responsible for writing accountability reports, sometimes testing reports, some of the time. I would do evaluations across the district. But I had enough access to the data to understand that the Texas miracle was not happening in Houston. And so it really troubled me. Now, a side but related story. So at the time, I had some friends who worked for a company called Enron. And I asked them, I'd never heard of Enron coming from Michigan. And I asked them, what is it exactly that Enron does and how do they make money? What do they do? And so they explained to me what Enron did and what their roles were in the company. And I thought to myself, in the back of my mind, I thought to myself, how does what they just described make money in the way that this company is showing in their quarterly reports and the conversations that are happening around the city? Well, it turns out that Enron wasn't making money, and the ways that they were making money were illegal by sending electricity in circles and these sorts of things. And when I found out about the Houston education miracle, the education miracle that became the primary evidence for No Child Left Behind, which has been the law of the land for the last decade, that essentially what had happened in Texas and what had happened in Houston was an Enronization of the data. And that really troubled me. And so after Rob Page went to the Secretary of Education spot, I realized that I felt like I wanted to be able to understand how something like this could happen. I wanted to be able to have the capabilities to do the research, to uncover the hidden truths in the data. And so that inspired me to go to Stanford Graduate School. And at Stanford, I worked with Linda Darling-Hammond, who was a mentor that helped me understand the complexities in education policy, helped me understand how we can understand equity and access across the spectrum of policies, whether it be charter schools, testing, accountability, vouchers. These are all topics that are really important conversations right now in 2015. So that's really how I arrived at the University of Texas, where I began my academic career. I was at Texas for 8 years and was tenured there, and spent a lot of time trying to understand the complexities of educational policy between 2006 and 2014 in that state. So that's really how I came to the work that I do, which is work on educational policy and how we can ensure that those policies don't camouflage the inequities in our system, and how we conduct rigorous research to understand how we develop policies that foment equity and access in our schools for Latino kids, for African American kids, for Asian American kids, Hmong kids, for poor white folks in rural areas. That is how I came to do the kind of work that I do today.
You speak of a lineage of education in your family. Sure. You gave a couple of examples of how that affected you, but can you say just a bit more about the tradition you come from?
Sure.
And what shapes your understanding of good education?
That's a good question. Well, as sad as it is, the education system where my family taught for many decades is now closed. It's now closed in the state of Michigan. My family, my parents, went to school in Saginaw Buena Vista School District. That district was closed in the last couple of years because of budget cuts in the state of Texas that drained funding from districts across the state. So districts that were operating on the margins or very near the margins essentially disappeared overnight. Part of that has been that we've lacked commitment to education, and part of that in terms of funding, and that we have decided that poor kids, low SES kids, that they should receive cheap education. Some people call it efficient education, but inexpensive education. So the context in which Saginaw Buena Vista existed was, it was a General Motors town. So for decades, there were good jobs. And so really what's happened in Saginaw Buena Vista over the last several decades is sort of representative of the transitions in America. So if you go back several decades, this was a booming town with auto factories, good jobs, great schools. And if I go even farther back, before that, the reason why my family, on both sides were attracted were because of the auto industry. And let me just go back, let me go back even farther. My mother's family, they were actually from Texas. They were migrant workers that moved north to Michigan to pick cherries, cucumbers, and they ended up in the auto factories in this blue-collar town in Saginaw because there was opportunity. On my father's side, they were coal miners in West Virginia. But my grandfather, he was a United Mine worker, and great-grandfather, and he ended up dying of black lung disease. But because of issues in the mines, they ended up in Michigan also as auto workers. So really, if you look back across my family's experience, you really see a representation of the changes in America. You see this migration to the auto factories, then you see the opportunity that they had to have blue collar, and my parents went to the University of Michigan. They had the opportunity to go on to higher education because the auto factory jobs provided the stability and the financial ability for them to do that. But I think to get to the core of your question, there was a time where they had this was a vibrant community with a vibrant public education system. And so what really strikes me about and inspires me is sort of the collapse of the education system in that community that I spent many summers in, where my family were educators in different capacities. And it's really due to the dramatic changing economic conditions in the United States, and how that's impacted the middle class, and how that's impacted towns where traditionally there were high-paying blue-collar factory jobs. And then, but the real downfall not only is tied to the economic issues that Michigan more broadly and Saginaw more specifically experienced, but also tied to the fact that when those things occurred, the response from the legislature was to starve these schools. It wasn't to support local education in neighborhood schools. It was to try to charterize the schools. And eventually, by starvation, or as Jitsu Brown from Chicago often says, financial sabotage, this community's public schools were deconstructed. So I know that the original question was about what inspired me about a quality education, but I also think, I think an important nuance to this is how you can clearly see in public policy a representation of the deconstruction of middle class, good paying jobs, and how that directly impacted the education of students in the community over several decades.
Can you say just a little bit about your own education?
Sure.
In primary and secondary?
So growing up, I attended both public schools and Christian schools. And I think people often, I often talk a lot about teacher quality, and the teaching profession is really under attack. And so one of the things that I was thinking about the other day is that, in my opinion, I never had a bad teacher. I never had a bad teacher. And I think that is one of the things that made a real difference in my life. Now, did every teacher understand me in the way that I wanted them to understand? Did every teacher have the patience with the energy and maybe vitality or vibrance that I had as a youth? Maybe they didn't. But I think that every teacher gave me the academic opportunities that I needed to be successful in the public and private school, Christian schools that I attended as a young person. I felt like when, and I think, when you get the ultimate sort of measure of this is when you get to college, do you feel like you're prepared? Do you survive? I think that's a very critical measure. And when I arrived at the University of Michigan my freshman year, I don't think that I had the preparation of the readiness of every single student in the freshman class. But I think that what my education provided me was the ability to adapt and to be resilient to different contexts. So I was able to, even though I was not the top student when I arrived at the University of Michigan, I graduated with honors, cum laude. So, and I was also able to experience the institution, a very diverse institution, because in the 1990s, Michigan was very focused on having a diverse community in many ways. And so I experienced the world in a way that really helped me form my ideas about, I'm not really okay with the balkanized society. I'm not okay with this side of the tracks and that side of the tracks. I think unfortunately some of our policymakers, because they had educational contexts in which they lived in highly segregated neighborhoods and highly segregated schools, whether they be black legislators, white legislators, or Latino legislators, I think we have really lost that priority of living in a multicultural community. Even politicians that are running for president have been criticizing what a multicultural community looks like or what it means. And folks that are running for the 2016 nomination for president. So that was, I think, another important takeaway from my educational experience is that I went to school with kids of different types. I went to school with kids of different SES levels. And so to me, that was normalcy. It's normal for me to live in a neighborhood in 2015 that has different folks of different economic backgrounds. It's normal for me to send my children to a school that is diverse in California. So I think that that's a very important takeaway, because we often think about education as being about what are the economics of this degree, what are the economic results of a particular high school. But I think there's a whole other set of things that our schools need to impart in our students. And that is broadly defined as citizenship, right? But then you say, well, how do you operationalize what citizenship? And I think I've done that in a few ways, which is readiness to live in a multicultural society, to participate in whatever endeavor with people of different types and maybe be a little bit uncomfortable, but find a comfortableness with that over time. And then finally, I understand that I was very fortunate to attend Stanford University because in our society, when you have access to the elite institutions of higher education, it gives you a different pathway in your life. Now, I didn't choose Stanford University for those reasons. I chose Stanford University because it was one of the top programs in education policy. But when I arrived, I didn't understand the giant thinkers that were at the institution. I didn't understand that my peers would become politicians, professors, heads of foundations. I didn't have the social and cultural capital to understand all of the aspects and the benefits of going to a Stanford, or going to a Michigan, or going to a Harvard. And so now in my career, I understand what fantastic preparation I had in my PhD program in Ed Policy Analysis. And I understand how important it is to have those relationships with professors who are giants in the world and what they do across different fields, and to have those relationships with my peers that came before me and after me in my graduate program. And that wasn't something that my parents really explained to me. I don't think they understood sort of the cultural and social mobility that is afforded you when you receive an elite graduate degree. state. And of course, my parents have been influential in providing me the information that I needed to be successful during my life. But because I think I had advanced beyond the stage where they were at, they didn't have the cultural and social capital to explain to me what this would mean, what it would mean for my life. And so I was just very fortunate to have that opportunity to attend the graduate school that I attended. So I think I learned different lessons from, in my K-12 experience. I learned a different set of things attending the University of Michigan, that other U of M, since we're here at, they keep talking about the U of M, and I think to myself, wait, that's the University of Michigan. But of course, in this context, being here in Minneapolis, U of M has a different meaning. And then, and then the doctorate. There were really important lessons that I learned all along the way that can be translated into a number and a particular salary range. I think we get so obsessed with what is the earning potential of different degrees. If I was thinking about earning potential, I probably would not have majored in history and in the humanities. But that wasn't was a priority to me. And so I also think that it's an important lesson, something to think about for folks that are watching, which is don't think about your education only based on what the economic return will be. There are so many other things that you are probably not envisioning being benefits of your educational experience. You will be a changed person at each and every level that you attend. So I always say the most interesting things in life are surprises.
What I'm hearing loudest from what you're telling me is that education, as you encountered it up through your doctorate, worked for you.
Sure.
That you could, and so showed you how it could work for other people. It isn't just you.
Sure.
And then there's the part of the story about you going off to Texas, where you thought they'd found a formula that would make education work for pretty much everybody, including people who are in various ways struggling pretty much everywhere else.
Right.
And as I understand the story of your time in Texas, it's the story of the discovery that this was a fraud of the magnitude of the Enron fraud.
Sure.
And roughly the same structure.
Right.
There has to be a human interest component to that story.
Sure.
How it felt to be in that career during that time, and the kinds of struggles involved in knowing that education could work, knowing that Texas was telling people that it was working,
Sure.
and knowing that it wasn't.
Sure.
Can you say a little bit about that part of your history?
So I think, I was a big fan of testing and accountability when I arrived in Texas, because I thought that finally, the idea is that accountability in Texas causes society to pay attention to the inequities that exist in society, because that's really the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is if you think about the really nice schools here in Minneapolis and the not so nice schools here in Minneapolis, or the really nice schools in Houston and the not so nice schools in Houston, or the really nice schools in Washington, D.C. and the not so nice schools, is that we know exactly who attends the really nice schools and exactly who doesn't attend the really nice schools. We know who those students are and what the differences are. And it's race and it's SES. That's the huge elephant in the room in the United States. And so what the realization was for me is this. If you're having a conversation with somebody, and that conversation goes in a direction that you don't really want it to go, you change the subject. And so what we've done with testing and accountability is just change the subject. We want to focus on these tests. We want to focus on these formulas at the expense of remedying what's really going on in our society. But it's not just high-stakes testing and accountability. It's charter schools. It's vouchers. It's Common Core. All of these, and this goes to the name of my blog, which is called Cloaking Inequity, which is that the work that I do seeks to uncloak the inequities in this policy, which is that they're trying very hard, there are folks that are trying very hard to not have the conversation that our nation really needs to have, which is that it's very clear what's happening in this society, but they are always trying to change the subject. And we thought that high-stakes testing and accountability was going to close the achievement gap by 2014. That's what No Child Left Behind promised. The reason why they promised that was because Texas was saying that they had done that. Now, 15 years later, no one is saying that Texas had an education miracle. They're still about where they were at 15 years ago. And so the problem, the thing that I think about in my work is that that's exactly the epiphany that we're going to have about charter schools in 10 years. That's the come to Jesus moment that we're going to have about vouchers in 10 years. Is that these policies, while purporting to be about civil rights and about remedying these historical gaps that have existed in this country because of, well, sadly, racism, is that these policies just change the subject. We know, for example, in Chile, let's talk about vouchers just briefly. Chile decided that they were going to use school vouchers decades ago. A dictator, Pinochet, decided that he didn't want the state to be responsible for education, and that education should be privately provisioned. Decades later, Chile has decided that the vouchers have actually magnified the segregation. Vouchers were initially created in the South to stop segregation, to stop desegregation efforts. What they did was they used public money to go to white folks so that they could go to private schools that black kids couldn't go to. Now, what's brilliant is that these policies were created for discriminatory purposes, and they've been reframed as civil rights and being about closing the achievement gap. The thing is it's not, you see Milwaukee making this argument that this is about black kids. You see Florida saying vouchers are about black kids. Test, if you go back, let me give you another example of this sort of inequity in policy that's camouflaged. Testing. Right now the conversation is if we just test black kids enough, magically the achievement gap will close because we'll be paying attention to it. But tests were not actually created to foment equity. Tests were created 1,500 years ago in China to sort their society, to decide who would be the leaders in the society. Tests came to this country in the form of IQ tests and deciding, because of the eugenics movement, which was a racist movement, and to decide which soldiers would be officers and who would go die on the front lines, which also directly impacts my family because my grandfather was in the army, but because he was black during World War II, it meant that he was not going to be fighting, that he was going to be building buildings in the Philippines, right? My grandfather wouldn't even talk to me about his experiences in the army because of the racism that he experienced. So these are really challenging issues that are persisting over time, and yet we're overlaying discriminatory policies, and at the same time, policies that were created to sort society, but magically they're now about civil rights. Discrimination, discriminatory policies, we cannot allow them to be reframed as civil rights. And that's what I first discovered in Texas, was that these policies were said to be about the kids. But it turns out Texas was grade retaining almost 50%, Houston, more specifically, was grade retaining almost 50% of their African American and Latino kids in the 9th grade, not allowing them to take the test that they had to take to graduate their sophomore year. So what it meant is we were talking about accountability, et cetera, and then the students that would drop out of school, they would use the system of management called the PEAMS to define them out of the denominator for graduation rates, because of course a graduation rate is a numerator over denominator. So when those kids disappear from the denominator, the graduation rate goes up. And so that's how high schools, when I talked earlier, had 0% dropout rates. It's not because those high schools actually had 0% dropouts. It's because they were using the Enron-tized data. They were using Enron methods to erase African American and Latino kids from those schools. And I'll say it directly. Rod Page made his career on the backs of Latino and black kids.
So I think it's probably important for something that goes out to 1 million people, many of whom vote, to understand the number magic here in a little bit better detail.
Sure.
So one way to get a magically high graduation rate is to make sure that people are out of the counting before before the out of the counting who would otherwise wreck it. What else is going on? I mean, there were numbers of various sorts coming out of Texas. What's the other magic?
Well, the thing is that we think that, oh, this is just a case of bad apples. What happened in Houston, what happened in Texas is well documented now in the research literature. But this is happening right now. So Arne Duncan, several years ago, has allowed the states to report their own graduation rates, their own denominators. It used to be that the federal government would calculate those independently. So Barack Obama has been talking about how the graduation rate in the United States is higher than it's ever been, right? So this isn't just a travesty that was occurring in the 1990s. This is a travesty that's occurring right now. Overnight, Texas went from like 27th or 28th in graduation rate to 3rd or 4th. I think it's either 3rd or 4th in the nation. Now, did Texas between year A and year B actually go from 27th in the nation to 3rd in the nation in graduation rate? Of course they didn't. So the travesty of hiding black and Latino kids in an elegant but false system of data continues to this day, and we are allowing it. We are allowing politicians to execute data systems and accountability and tests that are arbitrary and simply political. They have nothing to do with civil rights. They have nothing to do with the success of poor children. They have all to do with elections and creating a false but elegant bureaucracy, essentially a facade of numbers. So this is not just an issue from the 1990s and a Republican issue. This is also a Democrat issue because Barack Obama and Secretary Duncan are perpetrating the same falsehoods on the American public. Now, are there schools of excellence? Yes, there are. There are clearly schools of excellence. I was in a school in Fort Worth on Monday, Trimble High School, a beautiful school that has, it's in old layman's terms, it's a vocational school, but nowadays we call them career and technological schools, where they train people to do audio, visual work, where they train them to do culinary arts. But also in that school, there's a newcomer school. And the Fort Worth district has dedicated resources for the 300 or 400 students that are refugees, because Texas is actually one of the top it is the top refugee accepting state. I think Minnesota is in the top 5, and my home state, Michigan, surprisingly is number 3 in accepting refugees. And so they have schools that focus specifically on the needs of those students. So there are schools of excellence that are in real life increasing their graduation rates by providing an education that's interesting and applicable and valuable to their students. But unfortunately, our politicians, I think, besmirch our public education system by lying to the public about what's really happening to poor kids in our system. So on the one hand, they want to talk about all the successes they've had. And on the other hand, they want to talk about the failures of the public system. Well, our public system writ large is very successful. If you look at the top 10% of our schools and compare them to the top 10% of other countries, they do really well. The real issue in our society is that it's that elephant in the room that I talked about. It's the inequities in the system and how determined politicians, policymakers, and others are to convince us that these set of solutions, which have no basis in reality or empirical work are the solutions. But these are the same solutions that were created to foment inequity and to were created for discriminatory purposes. We know what works in schools. There's a whole set of research about things that matter in schools. High quality pre-K for every kid of any reform that I know has the biggest impact. Almost, depending on the study, it could have 0.8 standard deviations, and you have a band of error depending on the study on either side. Things like class size reduction. When teachers have less students to deal with, students perform better, on average. Even the most conservative estimates have it at a fifth of the standard deviation. And there's other things, high quality teachers. But we've been so focused on sending teachers into the classroom as quickly as we can to have as little experience as possible and haven't attended a college of education. We've been so focused on the adult cert programs. For example, in Texas, about 60% of all new teachers have had about 30 hours of training before they hit the classroom. But yet the current conversation is about how poor a job colleges of education are doing with training teachers. But the real issue, and again, what they're doing is they're trying to change the conversation. The real issue is that we're sending teachers that have absolutely no training, or just a little bit of online training, into classrooms to teach primarily poor and Latino kids. A very famous example of this is Teach for America. We used to say that sending untrained teachers to teach primarily poor kids, that used to be called discrimination. But Teach for America has changed that narrative, and all of a sudden sending unqualified teachers to teach black and brown kids has become civil rights. And so this is a part of the broader structural approach that's out there in education policy, which is that we're going to say we're talking about civil rights, but we're actually going to implement discriminatory policies.
What do you see that's most promising?
So I think some of the things that we talked about, which was the pre-K, we talked about class size reduction. We need to send trained, high-quality trained teachers. We need a national teacher strategy. If you look at the Singapores, the Finlands of the world, we like to talk about how they're not comparable to the United States. But we know that they have national teacher strategies to attract high-quality individuals who are committed to teaching as a profession over the long term into schools. But the challenge is that high-quality teachers, they're expensive. Teachers that you've only trained for 20 hours are very inexpensive. They're less expensive. Pre-K is very expensive. Smaller class sizes is expensive. We're so focused on providing inexpensive, cheap educational reform for poor kids. What we know how to do is how to do education expensive. What we don't know how to do is how to do education cheaply. Now, what people say is, oh, well, we spend a lot of money on education here in Minnesota or in New Jersey or anywhere. You often hear that response. And we can't just throw money at the problem. That's another sort of common challenge. But money buys things. And the issue is if you look across town, if you look on the other side of the tracks, if you look on the other side of the highway, what you'll see is teachers who are certified. What you'll see is teachers who have experience. What you'll see is beautiful football fields. What you'll see is they send their kids to Montessori, pre-K, etc. And so you don't have to go to Finland or Singapore to see examples of what works. All you have to do is go to the other side of town and see how the wealthy throw money at education. The only thing we're not okay with is throwing money at the education for poor kids. Because the wealthy, they know exactly what they want and need for their kids. And the fact that, let's say you're going to buy a house, what's one of the first things the real estate agent is going to tell you when she sees you have children? She's going to tell you about the schools. And she knows that across town, the schools in lower dollar houses are not as nice as the schools in this particular community. And so again, it's that elephant in the room. We know exactly what's happening in this society, but yet we're always trying to change the conversation so that we can provide a cheap, quote unquote, efficient education for poor kids. But the wealthy, they throw money at schools. So if we want, and when we say throw money at schools, they have high quality early education, they have high quality teachers, they have beautiful buildings, beautiful schools, all the things that we see in other countries. The wealthy provide their kids here. We've just decided that we want to ration high quality education for poor kids in our country.
the Obama administration has come into the conversation. You'd think this administration would have no reason to play along with the lies of its predecessor.
Sure.
What went wrong?
I also do comics on my blog, Cloaking Inequity. And one of the comics I once did was that Arne Duncan and Secretary Duncan and Secretary Bennett are essentially kissing cousins. If you look at George W. Bush's, George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush, excuse me. If you look at his education platform and you look at the policies that Barack Obama has attempted to prosecute over the last 8 years, you will find that Barack Obama has basically plagiarized the first Bush's education platform. If you look at Secretary Bennett from earlier, you'll see that the same sorts of themes in their conversations you see from Arne Duncan. And so, if I was Republican, I would be flattered by Barack Obama's education platform, because they plagiarized it from the Republican education platform from the 1990s and the 1980s. There's no new ideas. These are all recycled ideas from much earlier times. Now, the thing is that what Obama has in common with the earlier eras is that they're very focused on top-down reform, and they're very focused on privately controlled reform. Charter schools are public schools, but they are privately controlled. Assessment under No Child Left Behind went from primarily a teacher exercise to being privatized by Pearson and being required in every state. And so you can go across the spectrum of policies that quote-unquote ed reformers are interested in, and the common denominators of them are that they're top-down and they seek private control, and they put the hands of decisions into just a few people. And so that's what you see the Obama administration prosecuting, is these same sorts of approaches that you saw from earlier eras. Now, if they would have chosen different advice, the advice that they've been taking are from the Democrats for Education Reform, the Cory Bookers of the world, the Jonathan Alters of the world. These are neoliberals that are embedded within the Democratic Party. And so that's where Obama has been taking his advice. Arne Duncan has been secretary for 8 years. Now, I know that Arne Duncan is his basketball buddy, but Arne Duncan has done no favors to Barack Obama on education. He's been progressive in other areas, but on education, he's basically plagiarized the Republican platform from the 1990s and the 1980s. So I think the alternative for Obama, that would be more consistent with a progressive vision, and he's been progressive in other areas. On education, he clearly has not. A more progressive vision would be focused on community-based reforms. As a former community organizer, it would make sense that he would have policies that were consistent with community input and bottom-up approaches. And there's many of those out there. Local accountability in California is a bottom-up approach to accountability. Community-based schools such as Travis Heights Elementary Charter School, community-based charters is another example. So there's several examples of community-based approaches that would be more consistent with Obama's vision in other policy areas. But Arne Duncan has led them down the same path that we saw in the prior 2 decades.
Now, I sometimes think that old examples, old almost comic book examples, have terrific weight.
Yeah.
The federal marshals accompanying the African American children into the schools, where it was very clear on local initiative, they would, if there were local initiatives in Mississippi, if that had governed education in Mississippi,
Sure.
Integration would have never happened. At least it's hard to imagine it happening. There's so many areas in which the same narrative plays out.
Okay.
If the state or the village or the town or the citizens run it, the political realities mean that a certain kind of power broker runs it, and stupidities, inequities, injustices of the most horrific sort are built into the system. And what you pray for is a federal government intervention to break up that garbage
Sure.
and make something decent happen.
Sure.
And that's, I mean, across a broad range of stories,
Sure.
including the stories of the Second Vatican Council and the Catholic Church, are that story. And there's got to be something to it, right? I mean, there's got to be something to this absolute horror at local control, at community control, at community-based initiatives.
So the thing is that you can set boundaries, right? I mean, that's the role of the state and the federal government. It doesn't mean that we stop holding communities accountable for everything. What you do is you set boundaries. So I think one of the other complexities is that the accountability system is heavily reliant on a test, whether it be for assessment of teacher quality, assessment of school quality, district quality, whether a student can go to the next grade. It's heavily based on this high-stakes testing system, which we know is stratifying. And so the idea is how do we understand with more broad and more important measures the success of students, schools, districts, states. And so the idea is, how do we create dashboards of information that give us the information we care about? See, tests, we know they're a stratifying device, that's one thing, but they're also at 10,000 feet. When I flew into Minneapolis, I could look down at the city and make out things, small buildings and cars and trees. But the thing, and that's the level at which the tests we have now function. They're not valuable. We always talk about using data. They're not valuable for educators. The only people that those tests are valuable for are for politicians to look at. They're not valuable in the school setting. They may look at them at the beginning of the year, the end of the year, but they don't have enough information to inform instruction. And so the question is, how do we get information that's actually valuable to communities? In most countries, accountability systems are information systems so the public understands what's happening. But test scores and graduation rates, as we've talked about, they don't give us enough information. So we need a broader set of measures. We need to know about discipline in schools. Who's being disciplined? For what? That information is not readily available to the public. We need to know how many kids are going from that school onto college. How are they doing after their first year? We need to know information about climate. How do teachers feel about teaching in that school? How do students feel about being in that school? There's a whole set of information that we need that actually helps us answer the questions we care about, which tests have nothing to do with. They absolutely do not help us on any of those questions. But tests can be a part of a broader set of measures, because when schools are now measured on a broader set of things, that changes what they focus on in terms of their success. For example, we wrote a report and we were comparing New York, California, Texas, and we included the traditional test score metrics. But one of the things we were thinking about is we care about people's participation in a democracy. So how does voting look like for school-age children in these different states? Which is a measure of citizenship, which I think most people would argue we want our schools to create good citizens. So the question is, how do we create a dashboard of data that's actually interesting to communities? And then communities can focus and have a say in the metrics that they care about in their particular community. Now the state and the federal government can set categories, they can set boundaries, they can do those sorts of things. But communities need to be seen as the solution to these problems, not just the source of challenges, right? And by empowering communities to have those conversations about a wide variety of data, that changes what we're thinking about. If we're only focused on a test, which is what has been the context in education for the last 10 years, which was imported, of course, from Texas for our peer discussion, we want communities to have discussion about a broader set of information. A lot of that information is already available in state data sets across the US. So we need to make that data accessible to the public so the public can hold our schools and our politicians accountable for that information. Why is it that only 5 students went to college from our high school and 60 went to college from the high school across town? Why is that happening? What do we do in this school to encourage our students or career technology? Why is it that only 10% of the students who attended a career tech program received a certificate, whereas a school across town, that looks different? So we need to collect the data so that we can have the hard conversations, and then we can trust democracy to sort those things out. Information and data is power. And so by making that information and data accessible to communities, we can change the conversation away from a test and a fake graduation rate to the things that really matter to our society.
Well, in the early part of your career, you studied how measures that looked promising to you when you went to Texas, had been falsified, obscured, perverted in ways that fooled a whole lot of people of goodwill, including yourself for a while, to hide essentially a racist and classist system.
Sure.
And if we accept that community-based education is only going to work if you have some kind of decent measure of success, but we know that the last time people tried that in Texas, it pretty quickly turned into an Enron-shaped monster, because any statistical measure can be turned into illusion.
Sure.
So how optimistic are you in the last analysis?
I'll be honest, I'm optimistic. I don't think we can say we can't trust communities. We can't trust data. I don't think we can say that. I think that we, in this democracy, have to hold the people who collect that data accountable. We have to shine the light on that data. An example of, a really prominent current example of this sort of sleight of hand with data is New Orleans. So the school reformers got everything they wanted in New Orleans, and 10 years post-Katrina, the numbers don't look that great. If you look at the RSD, which is the Recovery School District, which is where they did a state takeover of all of the schools in New Orleans, made them into charters, or many of them, and Louisiana Data, you see that Louisiana and the RSD performed last and nearly last in almost all of this data. However, you have proponents of this top-down school reform approach going across the nation saying that there should be state takeovers in these recovery districts across the U.S., even though if you look carefully at the data, it does not bear that out. Now, they even have folks producing research studies that say, if you look at students in the recovery district compared to other Louisiana students, they do a little better statistically. Now, what's interesting is that that study is one of the few with data. Now, here's what's interesting about that. The state of Louisiana, over the last 10 years, has decided who will receive access to the data. And they've only decided that their political friends will receive the data to analyze their reform. Now, the courts finally changed that paradigm this year, and they told the state of Louisiana, you must release this data to researchers and to the community. The law requires that. But for a decade, Louisiana has gotten away with saying that their reform has been brilliant and refusing to release the data to the public. So that's a third complexity to the challenge that we're talking about. So not only do we have a challenge with community-based processes, but I have faith in democracy. Secondly, we have a challenge that people use data. My statistics professor said there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. So there are people that act in bad faith with data. That is definitely true. And the third thing is that there are hegemonic forces that have decided that we're only going to allow our political friends to have access to this particular data. And it took the courts a decade to step in and stop that sort of activity in Louisiana. Which is actually, if you think about it, if you read about Huey Long and you think about sort of the long history of Louisiana, it's kind of typical of that state. Louisiana is a beautiful state and beautiful people, but the politics of that state have been quite sordid over time. That's a third complexity I think that we should consider. But my mother always says, She says a couple of things. One, where there's smoke, there's fire. And so that's one of the things that really inspires me to investigate a lot of these issues. And she also says, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And so I think with data, we're able to provide sunshine to these very important issues. So I think that we need to hold our politicians and our government agencies accountable for collecting the proper data. Yes, we do. Do I think that community processes, as we've seen in California, so for example, we've studied the local accountability in California requires them to create what are called LCAPs. These are essentially strategic plans, local accountability plans. And so they were required to have a community process, right? But it's unclear. Some districts had more broad-based community processes, like you said. For the civil rights organizations, from our understanding of reviewing 50 different LCAPs in the largest districts across the state, the civil rights organizations were only involved in one city out of the 50, right? And I think that's a really serious concern that prominent civil rights organizations were not at the table in some of these community conversations, right? So are there going to be growing pains after 10 years of top-down reform when now we say we're going to involve communities in a messy democratic process to think about and reflect on a dashboard of measures for our district? Yes, there will be challenges. But I trust democracy, and I trust that by involving parents, by involving community stakeholders, we will, writ large, become more engaged with these conversations. And I think that's what reformers are afraid of. Because if we provide the information and give the entree to communities to be a part of this conversation, instead of letting just a few elites control charter schools or control various aspects of policy, control tests, etc., they're afraid that as communities are involved in these conversations, that they're going to lose a grip on the financial aspects of these conversations. Well, what do I mean by that? Wealthy business leaders, including a former Enron trader named Arnold, tried to a hostile takeover of the entire Dallas district, which is a $1 billion enterprise. They wanted, under an obscure Texas law called Home Rule, they were going to do a takeover of the entire district and hand it over to a politically appointed board, which would mean that $1 billion would no longer have public accountability, there'd only be political decisions made. And that's why, for example, you see the decisions that are being made in Chicago. They're closing schools in Black and Latino communities and sending those kids to other low-performing schools across town because you have a politically appointed board that's not accountable democratically to the public. They're only accountable to the mayor. And so I think it's important for us to have democratic say in the policies that occur. Let me give you an example of what happens when a community is angry about a decision. In Austin, Texas, the Austin School Board decided they were going to sign a sweetheart contract with a corporate charter school chain. Well, the community was very upset that their school was being taken away and being handed over to this charter school chain. So the charter school chain was in business for a year. Well, that next election, the community rose up and voted out those Austin School Board members that had brought in this, or made this deal with this corporate charter chain. And when they brought in the 3 new board members, what they did was they created a community-based charter school. A charter school that was a collaboration and voted on by the teachers and the parents in that school, voted on by the school board, voted on by the teacher associations, it involved the faith community. And so the community decided the direction of that school, rather than a corporate chain coming in and deciding what the direction of that school. But there's no recourse in a place like Chicago, and this is why there are parents and grandparents on a hunger strike for the last 30 days, because they have no recourse and they have no say because the elites have control of the charter board. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about democratic accountability, democratic say. Those are the principles on which our country is purportedly founded on. And so what we're talking about is community-based, democratically controlled reform as an alternative to the top-down, privately controlled reform that the elites would prefer.
Thank you.